clears the way for Xi Jinping to stay in power indefinitely and possibly for life.
This was a direct act by the Russian state against our country.
The police were acting under a court order to replace the management of the newspaper. The daily Turkish paper has a circulation of 650,000 people.
He's a professional liar. To lie is what he was taught in the intelligence school.
I'm a very strong believer in the marketplace of ideas.
This is the time to say the truth in post-truth era for Turkey.
I feel that there's no point in me trying to do anything without my friend from the propaganda department, because we're obviously joined at the hip.
I have the great privilege of interviewing four extraordinary women, journalists, activists, truth seekers, and truth tellers. And I could not be more honored because, as you saw from that incredibly powerful video, these issues around what's happening in our world, the rise of strong men, and they are men, the curtailing of freedom and democracy, all of which is taking place here in the first part of the 21st century, raise serious questions that every one of us have to address. Carrie and Etcha and Tamara and Eugenia are people who know of what they speak, and they're working in difficult countries. I have a great deal of admiration and respect for them. We have a lot of ground to cover. Really, it's their hour to tell us what they've learned and what lessons they think, not only in the countries they cover, the countries they're from, but in our own country and around the world, we need to be doing to apply those lessons. I want to start with some recent developments in the Middle East and in Europe. We'll move on to talk about the rise and changes in authoritarian rule, what it's like to be a journalist, especially a woman journalist, in these difficult environments. And we will talk about the strong men that these journalists cover, that we read about every single day, the role of technology, what we can do to get the world back on a track that is more respectful of human rights and freedom, and return the ideal of democracy as well as the practical reality of it. So let's get started. Now, let me begin by addressing Eugenia, who I want her to just say a few words about herself, and then I want you to address what's going on in Syria. I mean, you're not only a journalist, you're a political scientist. You used to teach at Moscow University until the government stopped you from teaching. And what do you see happening in Syria, and what role is Putin playing, and what are his objectives?
Thank you very much, Madam Secretary. I'm honored to be on this panel with you. I think that, to be honest with you, I think that what we see in Syria, a situation around Syria, is a pissing contest between two aging men. I wonder how you would handle the situation in Syria. But it may become very dangerous. You know, when I was leaving my country 2 days ago, and I was on the plane, I was leaving the country which was in the state of hysteria, the country that assumed, due to the propaganda that was pouring out of the Russian TV, that we are on the verge of the war with the United States. Because there was a tweet by the president of your country who warned us, Russians, that he was going to bomb and to bring smart bombs, and that we Russians should wait and see. And there was a response from our generals, and that they were going to retaliate. So I was sitting on the plane and I was thinking, what if, while I'm on this 10-hour flight from Moscow to JFK, when I land, am I going to be taken to the detention center, or whether I will proceed to the Empire Hotel? It's a very dangerous situation. I think that in general, we live in a we are living through the illiberal political cycle. For the 12th year in a row, Freedom House, the monitoring organization which is tracking the situation with political rights and civil political liberties and civil rights across the globe, their stats suggest that the world is backtracking from the democracy. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, in 71 countries across the globe, United States included, the variables for democracy, for political liberties and civil rights are going down the hill. This liberal political order requires our attention, but also it requires leadership. It's a very dangerous situation because some countries are lacking interest in this liberal political order. Others are lacking means to stand for it. And it's not just a problem in our part of the world, but I'm afraid this will impair democracy in the United States as well. You will be less free, less prosper, and less safe. That's what it comes out of the situation in Syria.
You know, I want to turn to Tamara, who is from Georgia, a country that Russia invaded some years back now, more than 10 years, and
started earlier in 90s.
Yeah,
just
and
finalized.
started in the 90s, but seized 2 provinces. So when you hear about what Russia is doing, you also have to think about what's happening in Europe. Viktor Orban just won an election, basically putting himself forward as an authoritarian leader. Georgia has always been trying to move toward the West and having problems with that. How do you see the situation in Europe?
Autocracy is becoming fashionable. Well, I'd like to refer to Evgenia. I just want to calm you down that even if you were taken to detention center, you would have been treated by independent judiciary, so you don't have to worry about that.
Judging by the previous panel?
There will be a judge. There will be an independent judge because you are in the United States, you are not in Russia. So, well, I come from Georgia. But I only became the citizen of Georgia when I was 16. This is when Soviet Union collapsed. So I have a totalitarian. I've lived in totalitarian communism, and I just want to make a disclaimer that I will not be speaking to you from some theoretical perspective. I am the one who lived in a repressive regime and who experienced liberation, which came at a very high cost. It's here all in my head. And here on my T-shirt, you see a Georgian freedom fighter. She died 100 years ago fighting Soviet occupation by Joseph Stalin. So she was fighting for her fundamental rights, freedom of expression, freedom of faith, equal rights, women's rights to vote, because those principles were enshrined in the Constitution of Independent Georgia adopted in 1918. But Georgian democracy lasted only for 3 years. Young Georgian democracy was lost to evil Soviet empire, and so were half of Europe and many more countries. They were lost because the West ignored the threat of totalitarian communism until millions have been killed and until millions have been deprived of their fundamental liberties. And I am one of them. And now, as we sit here, ominous threat is gathering. Another monster is sitting in Kremlin, whose role model is Joseph Stalin, and who believes that collapse of the Soviet evil empire was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Putin is fanatically committed to his cause, to reverse history and restore Russia's dominance, and for Russia to dominate the West. He's very serious about it. I'm afraid he's more serious than the West is about Russian threat. Even now, when diplomats are being expelled, like from all over the free world, and Putin's close circle of oligarchs are being sanctioned. So I believe that in order to address this threat and in order to change so that autocracy is not contagious, like we need to realistically evaluate the problem. And let's face it, like post-Cold War order is already appended. 1/5 of my country is occupied by Russia, so is Ukraine. Well, but Putin didn't stop there, because some of you may ask, why does it bother me if Georgians are struggling there or Ukrainians, like except for humanitarian purposes? Well, because Putin went against UK in the most egregious way, because Putin is meddling in French elections by financing ultranationalists, because Putin is meddling in the US elections. So he needs us. He's manipulating us to dominate you guys. So that's your problem too. So in order to solve this problem of authoritarianism, rising authoritarianism, we need to assess the threat properly and then come up with coherent strategy to contain and roll back Russian expansion. We need kind of a new Truman doctrine.
You know, I think one of the main points that Tamara is making is that the other side, let us say Putin, but it's not only Putin, the other side has a very clear strategy.
Exactly.
They know exactly what they're trying to do. And I think for a while we were a little confused and believing that there had to be a path forward that wouldn't spark a conflict, that wouldn't return to a cold or even, heaven forbid, a hot war. But there are other examples of leaders seizing power right now after having a democratic state. And Ece, I want to ask you, because Turkey is an example of that. Mm-hmm. Turkey has a leader who is now incredibly clear that he wants to consolidate all power and has done so, including creating a strong presidency that he now holds. How did this happen? How did it happen? Because, we can understand when Putin refers to the collapse of the Soviet Union as the worst catastrophe in history. There's a history there. We can look at it. We can see it. Turkey was on a different track until relatively recently. What happened?
Well, we can talk about Putin, we can talk about Erdogan, we can talk about Chinese leader, which we will be doing today. But I do think that we shouldn't be talking about these men necessarily, but we should be talking about the system that, created these men, because there's a pattern. In each country, and unfortunately, United States is now witnessing the same pattern. Each country, populism, right-wing populism, disturbs the politics in the same way. There are many similarities in between these countries. I know that in the United States, people like to think that they have a strong establishment, and this establishment, this political mechanism, the mature democracy in this country will protect you from the madman tactics of Mr. Trump. We thought that too, 15 years ago. I know that Turkey seems like a crazy country at the moment, but 15 years ago, Turkey was not a crazy country. And you don't lose your democracy with a spectacular Reichstag, like a Nazi era. They don't bomb the parliament all of a sudden. There are many scattered mini Reichstags, so to speak, throughout 15 years. And this process begins, just like now it's happening in the United States, with toying with the state apparatus. What you are going through at the moment, Mueller, Comey, and whatever happens around it, is actually the starting point of your mini Reichstag. Dismantling the state apparatus. The first thing they do is that they make you feel that they can toy with the system. And if the establishment is not quick enough to respond, actually, even if you're opposing to the president, you feel like, well, we don't need this state apparatus as much as we thought we did. And then, by time that establishment that you think that will protect you from the madman tactics of this government is actually, it's becoming a paper tiger. And then the process goes on, the right-wing populism invading the state apparatus process goes on by dismantling the entire system and meanwhile invading it. This is the one similarity in all these countries, as much as I know, as far as I can see. And in Turkey, it happened in a very saddening way. My country is a very beautiful country, and she thought herself as a Western country. And she was getting ready to be part of European Union. At least she was aiming to that target. And since its establishment in 1923, the idea of the establishment was to be part of European Union, part of Europe, part of the Western society. But the entire perception of Turkey changed in 15 years, thanks to not only one man, but those who were silent while that man was doing his madman tactics. So.
Well, this is not only a problem in Russia and Europe, Georgia and Turkey as two examples. I mentioned Hungary with Viktor Orban's dramatic move toward right-wing populism after having been a crusading young activist against communism and against the abuses of the state. He's now taken very tight control over these organs of government. We saw something else happen just recently, though. Nobody would claim China is a democracy, Carrie, but China had a system. And its system was a government by consensus among the Communist Party, the Politburo, the top-ranking members of those institutions, and there was an agreed-upon set of rules, what we would call norms. And the norms required that the leader prepare for his succession. And we saw that over the last 40-plus years. But something happened. And Carrie, you covered China for a long time. I know you're a Mandarin speaker. Explain to us what did happen, because again, it's kind of what you've already heard and what Etche ended with. Clearly, people around Xi Jinping decided to keep their silence and to let him upend the rules in a way that had not happened before.
Yeah. So Xi Jinping, very interesting character, doesn't get as much attention or as much critical attention from the world as he needs and deserves. I'd first like to apologize for not being a Chinese national on this panel. But it is very dangerous for a Chinese national to say anything critical about Xi Jinping, as we can observe. And I have, as Madam Secretary says, been reporting from China for the best part of 30 years on and off, so I'll do my best to explain what's going on there. And I would also like to take in a way to place this in a historical context. Madam Secretary mentioned the 40 years in which China had a certain kind of a system for managing elite politics. Obviously, in a one-party state, elite politics can be a very fragile and dangerous game. And China, given its deep imperial past, palace coups, murders, all kinds of horrendous upsets that nobody predicted and that caused turmoil and millions of deaths have happened over and over and over. So, Deng Xiaoping, the successor, if you like, of Chairman Mao, decided we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to have a system. We're going to have kind of, a set of equals, and so it will go on. We'll have a routine whereby people are replaced every 10 years. That went on for 80s, 90s, first decade of this century. But what then happened was that the Chinese model started to fall as far as even those who admire it they felt it was falling into decay, that it was being overtaken by corruption, fiefdoms of the tigers, as they called them in the Chinese Communist Party, that they were just kind of dividing up, the nine dragons were kind of dividing up the kind of empire between them, and that it was becoming ungovernable, and it wasn't being governed in the interest of the public. So the Communist Party itself felt, for the sake of its survival, it needed a slightly stronger leader, needed to concentrate more power in that leader. Meanwhile, China is, although it likes to state that it's an exceptional place, and it is an exceptional place in many ways, it is very much lives in the historical context of the rest of us. So, things we saw, 1991, the disintegration of the Soviet Union, incredibly important to China. 2 years before that, you'll all remember 1989, Tiananmen Square, democracy protest, followed by a massacre. Now, what happened then? The Berlin Wall came down at the end of 1989. Did you see any protest in China? You did not. And the Chinese Communist Party leaders sitting there thinking to themselves, good job we did on June the 4th, 1989, because we ensured that there was barely a squeak, in November, at the time when communism was beginning to crumble all over Europe. And again, 1991, Soviet Union disintegrates, end of the communist system. That's the big brother to the Chinese. Big brother, little brother. Now, roles reversing. The Chinese Communist Party basically said to itself at that point, oh my word, they have lasted, about 70 years or so. We want to last much longer than that. Xi Jinping himself already has a plan for 100 years of communist rule. So they were looking at sustainability of the one-party state. And they basically said to themselves, the key to this is to create a cage inside the heads of our young people. So the first thing to do is to get them from kindergarten age and fill them with a sense that for 200 years, we are a nation who have been horribly humiliated and by the Brits and then all the other colonial powers. And now we're not going to have that anymore. We're standing up, we're standing tall, etc. And so anyone who says they want to create democracy in China is an enemy who is trying to undermine our stability, our coherence, our sense of our identity. So the Communist Party wrapped itself in the flag of the nation very firmly, took all the kids in with it, and now you have a massive groupthink in China. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, stuff was happening that was helping build that message for the party. You had, obviously, 9/11 massively distracted everybody from a strategic competitor, which was China. It wasn't as if the Bush administration coming in 2001 didn't see that China was building up to being a strategic competitor. They did see. But then they got distracted by 9/11 and the rest is history. 2007-8, the global financial crisis, the Chinese looked on and said, oh, okay, you know, they're not the rulers of the universe, the masters of the universe. After all, you know, perhaps we can do this better. And certainly that was the message they started telling their public. Then you had the Arab Spring, which was, at the start, the Chinese Communist Party was very scared of that, or certainly made out that it was very scared of that, and crushed hard on anyone in terms of NGOs or protesters. However, obviously, as a success story, the Arab Spring is complex, and, you know, the Chinese certainly have been able to paint it to their own public as a failure, and they have painted it as an effort by Western power to get in and dominate, divide, and cause chaos. So that's the way the Chinese narrative of the world goes, that we, meanwhile, in China, have been ticking over, getting richer, getting better. Our economy is now 2/3 as big as the American one, and sure as hell, we intend to be first in the world. And the Chinese dream, the talk of Chinese rejuvenation that comes with Xi Jinping is all part of that. Coming to Xi Jinping himself, came to power in 2012, 2013, and Xi Jinping basically was the compromised character, and everyone thought, oh, you know, we can pull the strings on him. And very few people predicted the kind of person that he was going to be. And if I might be allowed a couple of minutes just to explain what an extraordinary life story that man has, which is undertold. You know, so he grew up in the palace. His father was a revolutionary hero, but then as a result of falling out with Chairman Mao, or, you know, these issues do happen in China, his father was imprisoned, humiliated, his sister died, possibly suicide. Great Leap Forward, Cultural Revolution, all this horrendous chaos going on in China. Xi Jinping himself, you know, end of privilege lifestyle, out on the street kid for a bit, then down to the countryside, lived in a cave, worked as a farmer, and then do you know what he did? Instead of reviling the Chinese Communist Party, as some red princeling elite of his generation did, he said, I'm getting back in there and I'm going to the top. And that is an extraordinary degree of kind of commitment and strategic vision. So people should not underestimate Xi Jinping, I would say. Then when he came into power in 2012, it was basically, I'll take on all enemies, you know, I'll take on the enemies in the party, the tigers, put them behind bars. And outside, he took on, you know, NGOs, the feminists, the religious movement, the labor movement, social media. There isn't anyone who hasn't seen their red lines contract in China to the space of a newspaper. So these are very dramatic events happening in China at the moment. And because of all the other things going on in the world, I mean, Putin, there's a bit of me that kind of thinks, Putin, you know, Putin and whose army? Behind him is now the big brother. You know, this is a very big, powerful state. The Russian, you know, obviously Putin can cause a lot of trouble, but do we not think that China can cause a lot of trouble? And because of Chinese economic power, you don't see Hollywood films kind of wondering what damage China can do. You increasingly don't see attacks on China in the press, in academia, in publishing, because censorship applies not just in China now. This birdcage of the mind that China has inflicted on its own people internally is now global.
Well,
Tamara, yeah.
Can I just say something? I completely share your view that there should be more attention paid to China, but the fact is that China has not invaded like its neighbor for the last decade. So that's what makes China different from Russia, because Russia is currently occupying and ethnically cleansing the populations. Like 400,000 of my compatriots have been ethnically cleansed.
So I'm not arguing, Tamara.
Yeah.
I understand exactly why it's happening.
So
it's happening because China is very good at playing just beneath the radar. If you think China's not running political influence operations, you know, like Mueller indictments, are you kidding? Chinese money is everywhere in our politics. In our media, in our academia. It's serious. But I understand it plays below the radar and its money counts.
You know, on a strategic level, it's always been interesting to me, because if I were in a position to be concerned about Russia's future, I would be looking. I would be looking to the east. Because you're right in one sense, Tamara, that there hasn't been a kind of a military invasion except of certain atolls and reefs in the South China Sea, which the Chinese are taking over. But there has been a steady stream of Chinese moving across the Russian border along the east. So in effect, there is a very interesting dynamic going on. It's almost as though Putin is ignoring what is the biggest strategic threat over time to Russia in order to try to destabilize and overturn democratically elected governments in the West. But I wanted to follow up on something that Carrie said, because, and Eugenia, one of the things we know is how Putin has mixed authoritarianism with corruption, very selective, specific corruption, to keep a group of oligarchs in line, but also on his side. Can you talk about the role that corruption plays in authoritarianism?
I think that corruption is one of the most powerful tools of the authoritarian regimes, as long as there is no constraints and no controls over those in power. In Russia, the situation is even more difficult because it is the first time in our history that the institution of the political police, what used to be called the KGB in the Soviet times, took over. The political police always was a very important institution in Russian history. However, under Tsar or during the time of the Soviet Union, political police was an instrument of power, whereas now it is power, it is essence of the state, it is being. And this is extremely dangerous because it is some sort of fraternity that exists now. About 70% of all offices in the administration of the president and the apparatus of the government is taken by the graduates of the Soviet Union's political police. These are people with a very conspiratorial mindset, with a constant eager and search for internal and external enemies. These are people who totally disregard for human rights. They don't believe in self-governance. They don't believe that in people's ability to run themselves. They suppress any protest. And of course, as we're well aware, that it was in the Soviet Union's national security doctrine, and back now it is on the Russians' national security doctrine, that the United States is enemy number one. This is a very closed and cohesive group of people who control all the major resources in the country, whether it's oil or gas or telecommunications and banking system or the major TV channels. Unfortunately, for quite a period of time, the West was blind about the development of these events in Russia. Basically, Putin committed a silent coup that nobody noticed when he brought this immense corporation of people in appellats into power in Russia. So corruption is the way of redistribution of assets among these power elites, whereas the rest of the population has just crumbles of it. And you may say that it's rather strange that on March 18th, Russians once again, more than 50 million Russians, once again sort of voted for Putin into presidency for the fourth and de facto the fifth term. And I think it's very important to understand that, first of all, we didn't have election, just no elections whatsoever. It was acclamation, not election. He's not the guy who was voted into presidency by the popular vote. That's the elites that brought him in. But the second thing that's important to understand, I think, that Russia, it is the nation of survivors. This is the nation, this is the country, along with Georgia and other former Soviet republics, which went through the bloody 20th century. 13+ million people perished in the civil war. then famine, collectivization, trenches of the awful war where we lost 29 million people, gulag, repressions, war of the state against its own people. The cost is immense. From 60 to 70 million people perished. That's what's the price we paid to the 20th century. So for survivors, the main mindset of survivors is very different from everybody else. Survivors are not looking about the bright future. Survivors just hope that the things won't go worse. And therefore, then when they, so to say, voted for Putin, they voted for things to stay as it is.
Yeah.
May I add something to this? I don't know if we should call this corruption. It is actually, it's not coincidental, and it's systematic. And I think it's more than corruption. And this is another pattern, a similar pattern that we see in the countries that witness right-wing populism and rising authoritarianism. Actually, leaders are building safety nets for themselves by bringing, by distributing the state wealth to these vassals, which are loyal to, who are loyal to him personally. But then it's not crumbles. It is, it is micromanagement of, riches, state riches. It's the micromanagement of state riches to reach the bottom of the society. It's not only oligarchs that the populist leaders are, connecting to themselves, but also by micromanagement, they also distribute the riches of the, state to the most poor people. And by doing that, they are building the safety net for themselves to stay in power. And then it becomes not a myth, but a reality when people say, when Putin is gone, Russia is gone, or when Erdogan is gone, Turkey is gone. It is not a myth that a propaganda machine creates. It is the truth, because, that's why all these hooligans of these populist leaders are as if fighting for their lives in ballot boxes to get in some fake votes, because they are actually fighting for their lives. They are fighting for their bread, they're fighting for their job, they're fighting for their company. So in order to do this, the populist leader had to turn the social rights into subjects of political charity. And I think Trump is starting to do that by tariff decisions of China, decisions of trade. The big companies, New York Times first page is screaming about these tariffs, but in other parts of the country, in Minnesota, for instance, people are, happy with this decision. So actually, Trump, quite in a clumsy way, I should admit, starting to build his safety net. He didn't just go there to Saudi Arabia to do that crazy dance with the, with the swords. He was actually making his first attempt to build his financial safety net, because this is the only way to survive. In a real democracy, as you might all know, he cannot survive.
Yes, but again, I understand why authoritarian leaders want to make themselves in the eyes of the people look indispensable, so that they cannot be replaced, that if they are replaced then the country is gone. But the United States will have elections in 3 years, and if he is re-elected, if he's not elected, he's not elected. He's gonna go. He will have to obey the will of the people. And that's the major difference. And when we are talking about Putin's Russia, and when we are talking about their strategies and their sort of policies, we shouldn't lose the focus here. We shouldn't lose the focus here. No matter what you think and what Americans think about their president, America is not Russia. America is checks and balances. America is American Constitution. And what we should hope for, that constitutional system somehow sort of deals with this challenge and doesn't break up. So this is what we should care about. This is not, I mean, we shouldn't be losing focus here, because again, this is what Putin wants. That's Putin's goal, just to make sure that everybody thinks that there is no right and wrong, and that everything is gray and everybody is the same. We shouldn't let him do that. That should be our goal, to make the difference.
And you know, we do have an election in November of this year.
Yeah.
Very important election. Carrie?
I'm just going to channel Xi Jinping for a moment, and I'm going to say to you all, show, not tell. You know, Xi Jinping, were he sitting here, he'd say, Yevgeny's point, I run a nation of survivors. We've had famine, we've had civil war, we've had imperial conquest, all in people's lifetimes. We also had the Great Leap Forward, we had the Cultural Revolution, we've had democratic politics, he would say. You know, your kind of democratic. That kind of lock-her-up language, that's what China experienced in the Cultural Revolution, and people are scared of having it back. Do you know what I mean? That kind of language that took place here in 2016 is the kind of language that gives democratic politics a terrible name in a country like China.
So that's why, actually, I'm sorry.
No, I haven't finished, Eji.
I'm sorry.
So that's one point. So but what's different, and what I would also say is different. So Yevgeny said, you know, Russia is a nation of survivors who just want it not to get worse. Well, China's a nation of survivors who really believe it's going to get better. You know, so you've got a system where, you know, you need to show, not tell, that liberal democracy is better. Because at the moment, you know, the Chinese, they've been told, as I was saying, ever since kindergarten, that, you know, theirs is better. And then they've got a world where the Chinese economy is getting stronger, where their lives are improving in material ways, a lot of them, and where they look across the water, their media tell them every day, and they live behind the Great Firewall of China, and their social media tells them the same, and it's certainly swept clean of anything that might tell them different, that, you know, that liberal democratic politics, even in Europe and North America, is pretty much broken at the moment. And that they, meanwhile, they have a leader in Xi Jinping who is dealing with corruption, so not running a corrupt state, somebody who is dealing with the corruption. Now, that's an arguable point, but it's certainly one where he can make an argument. And because he's got all these, you know, he runs all these tumbrils down to the prison every day with kind of these, you know, these guys who once wore the nice suit and had, you know, oiled black hair, and now their hair's gone white, and they're weeping in court and saying, oh, I'm so sorry to the Communist Party, I'm so sorry to the Chinese people, and they're kind of, it's happening on a daily basis, so people get the impression that he's dealing with corruption. We shall see. And then he's dealing with toxic air, he says. He's dealing with the toxic wasteland created by, you know, a 20th century high-speed industrialization. I mean, he kind of had the 19th century industrial revolution. You know, China had it obviously in the late 20th century largely. And now in the early 21st century, he's trying to turn a middle-income economy on a massive proportion, 1.4 billion people, into an innovative, green, blah, 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 21st century, world-beating economy. That's a big project. And he says, you know, coming back to Madam Secretary's point about why did he lift the term limits and why is he possibly going to rule forever, he says to his people, he doesn't need to articulate all of this. It's clear, some of it is articulated and some of it is well understood between the lines in China. The message is, you give me the power, you know, I'm a guy who grew up in the cave, who, you know, understands both the party and understands the man of the people, and I'm going to do it for you. I'm clean, I've got a strategic vision, I'm going to deal with poverty, I'm going to deal with environment, and look at those Americans, what a mess they're making of their politics, you know. Would you want that chaos again? So all I'm saying to tomorrow, and those who argue for liberal democracy, which of course I believe in, is like, you have to show the rest of the world that it works.
Yeah, well,
Kelly,
yes,
I agree. No. I want to say that I think you're wrong, that you don't have to prove to them that the regime of liberal democracy is better than, you know, this corrupted, you know, authoritarian regimes or populist regimes that they have. Because they make money inside China or inside Russia,
but they want to spend
it in the
exactly.
West.
Where are
and
their kids getting education? Where are they getting villas? Where they want to go for holidays?
We just ran. I'm sorry, Tamara.
Shopping.
We just ran, you know, an investigation, my magazine, of kids of the Russian elite, where they study overwhelmingly, they study here in the United States or in the United Kingdom, but they prefer Ivy League universities here.
I completely
And
agree with
therefore-
Evgenia.
Who cares, Yevgenia? Who cares? Frankly,
They
the Chinese.
care.
No, I would like to.
They care. They care.
Hang on, I haven't. Just let me finish the
why
point.
don't you send your daughter to study in Moscow University?
Hang on a minute. Hang on a minute. China has always outsourced contention. It can see the point in contention. It can see the point in people having arguments about different ideas and so on. It just wants it to happen over there. So I want my kids, if I'm Xi Jinping and Xi Jinping's daughter did go to, university in the US, despite the fact that he won't let Western ideas go into Chinese universities
Because
anymore.
the West is better. And that's why there is a simple answer. They are getting better education, they are getting better living standards, and that's what we want for us. And in order, like when we're talking about confronting Russia and when I'm talking about like Truman Doctrine and all these things, in order to come up with the coherent strategy, what we need to do is to understand what Russia is doing, to understand the components of Russian hybrid warfare. Because like we said that Putin's overarching goal is to like sort of restore Russia's dominance and to dominate you guys. But how does he do that? How does he do that? Well, it is essential for him not to allow democracies at his borders. Why? Because like it's very difficult to bully a prosperous democracy into being Russia's vassal state. Second, democracy, when it's prosperous, it's contagious. It's contagious. And this is what Putin is afraid of. And that's why he's afraid of all this like NATO expansion and everything. He's not a stupid guy. He knows that there is no military threat coming from NATO countries. NATO countries do not want to wage war with anybody. NATO is something just to keep the peace. But that's why he's opposing. So his military doctrine, this hybrid warfare has four components. First is military, and like we know he's been using that, like in Georgia, I already said that. He's using subversive intelligence by financing satellite political parties, infiltrating in the government, by sanctioning contract killings and like terroristic attacks. My dear friend, 2 years ago in Tbilisi, before Skripal, like my dear friend Givi Targamadze, the leader of the opposition MP, like could miraculously, I don't know, like by the thin hair, like sort of survived terroristic act, but ordinary citizens were wounded. And this is what he is doing. Economic measures, like Georgia was subjected to severe economic embargo, like mass deportation of Georgians like from Russia took place, like energy blockade, and the last but not the least, of course, is disinformation. And he's basing disinformation on fears. And like, of course, he's using Soviet methods as well. I saw this on CNN, this poor lady, like who was working for this Russian troll factory without knowing that. He's using useful idiots. Of course, he's using useful idiots. What he's doing is that he's making them, thank you. He's making them serve their interests without realizing they've done so. And he bases his disinformation and propaganda machine on fears. In Georgia, it's based on 3 fears, and all these fears have some realistic grounds. First is the fear of war, and it's realistic. Russian tanks are just 40 kilometers from Tbilisi. So rhetoric is, West is not going to care about you, nobody will fight Russia for you, so you have to get along with me. Second is the fear of poverty. Georgia is a poor country, so rhetoric is nobody wants your product in the West, so you have to get along with me and play well with me in order to allow like your goods like be allowed in the Russian market. And the third is fear of losing cultural identity, and this is where we women suffer, because he is reinforcing macho culture as an alternative to Western civilization where people can be equal. So that's the problem.
I want to follow up on that point, because I think I want to ask each of you to talk about what happens to women in authoritarian regimes, because very often the tightening up affects all kinds of groups. We've seen that in many of these countries. But it also affects half the population, because all of a sudden women's roles and women's rights and women's leadership is diminished. So what have you seen with respect to that in Turkey? And do you have any personal stories that you could share?
Well, actually last year you were here, you were talking about your personal story, and I thought, oh, she knows what I feel. because you were talking about how you survived the social media harassment and all that, you know, mess, let's say, to cut it short. It really feels like, you know, when you are harassed by the government supporters on social media, and when you lose your job, as I did, and when you're stigmatized, written on your forehead, like, you know, persona non grata, you feel like you're having a sword fight with the ghosts. Because you don't know if these people are there, these social media profiles. You don't know what's happening. You don't feel like responding to it. But then if you don't respond, it is this, you know, very post-truth virtual thing. And I was going to say, actually, and referring back to your last year's speech, you were here talking about your emotions in the first part of your speech, and everybody was, you know, very, very careful. And then in the second part of the interview, you talked about the real stuff, Syria, China, Russia, and people were a bit less interested, I thought. And then I thought, like, you know, okay, this is it. When women do not talk about emotions, even women lose some sort of, you know, interest a little bit. Yeah. And I wanted to say to you, you know, to American women, in fact, be careful about this emotion thing. It is overrated, especially when dealing with, you know, madman. So I'm writing a book, that's why I'm thinking about these things in a more, you know, I'm trying to see the big picture. I'm trying to see the global pattern of rising right-wing populism, how these bullies came to, you know, be our leaders all of a sudden. It's a global movement, so it requires a global response. Therefore, it requires a global conversation, and it requires women's conversation, women talking to each other. And thanks to Tina Brown here, it's, you know, I think it's right time to thank her. Thanks to Tina Brown and the miraculous crew, they built this palace of communication, and they knitted this very colorful tapestry of solidarity for us to touch each other. For women, what these regimes to these women is so destructive, because misogyny is actually an integral part of right-wing populism. It's not because they necessarily hate women, but they start with the less strong. They start with children.
We're not less strong. I don't agree with
Well, I'm going to give everybody a chance to talk in the 10 minutes we've got left. So I'll give everybody a minute or two. So
they start with the, you know, women. They start with trees, they start with children, they start with animals, and then they get to men. And when they get to men, it's always too late for men to defend themselves. And when it starts with women, it's so disgusting to say this, but men secretly think, well, she's a woman. We don't have to defend her. We can find a way to deal with this new status quo. And then when they find out that they cannot, actually it comes to them as well, this authoritarian regime, you know, with its pounds, it's too late for them to defend themselves. Women act as coal mine canaries in these regimes. It's not because they have antennas or something. They feel what's coming towards them, because they are the first ones who feel the regime and its, you know, the nails of it. And I was so thankful to American women to be so quick to respond with their pink hats and in so massive numbers. Wow, it was amazing. And, you know, last thing, we need a global conversation, I said. So, United States space in other countries has lately been soldiers' space. It's always this militaristic phase. But once this country sent its young people as Peace Corps volunteers to underdeveloped countries to teach them English. They did not only teach English, they spread the idea of freedom, equality, and they brought this another perspective to these people's life. And my mother is one of those kids who learned English from a Peace Corps volunteer. This country has infinite number of beautiful faces. This country does not deserve to be presented by that military face and by an orange face, I should say. So please be there. Please be there and speak for the United States, for your country.
Eugenia.
Russia has a very mature culture. Basically, many of you saw our president topless time and again. And that's manifestation of this culture as it is. However, I think I was extremely impressed when I saw the Women March on the next day after inauguration of President Donald Trump. And of course, this Women's Rights March was followed by the Kids March, who marched against the possession of weapons. And this is a very powerful message that goes across the globe. Because, when people in my country, you cannot see this on propaganda TV channels, but you can see it on the web, when they see that people resist, and that's obviously about resistance, when people resist the power, that's an extremely important lesson, because democracy is about learning. Democracy is about the sense of togetherness. Authoritarian regimes are based on dividing people, on putting people against each other. So it's very important for us to see this example of resistance that exists in the United States. But I also want to say that, I understand that Putin may seem to you as a very frightening man, but trust me, I live there. He's no different from other autocrats. And what is important about these KGB men, and I've been studying them, since the perestroika times, so for the last, 25 years of my life, what's important to understand that you shouldn't be frightened, that they thrive on weakness. Then when Putin saw what he presumed as collective weakness of the West, he grabbed Crimea in 2014, and before that, he invaded Georgia in 2008. It is exactly the same what Stalin did back in 1939 when he grabbed Baltics, when he perceived West to be weak. So your strength is our future freedom.
Exactly.
Yeah, very nice, very nice. Tomorrow we have, I'm going to give you 2 minutes, and then Carrie gets 2 minutes.
I completely reject that we are the weaker sex or we are weaker. Just that we have more problems and more barriers to break. That's it. We are not weaker. And when I was entering public life, I knew what was coming. I knew because I had many examples. My husband, who was a freedom fighter before he entered to politics, he was protecting rights of religious minorities, and until now he's struggling a stigma of being an antichrist, because protecting religious minorities means that going sort of against Orthodox Church or something like this. Well, the thing is that what I wanted to say is we have to, what worries me is that there are some talks and conversations that we need to sort of regulate and give up our liberties because our liberty is under attack. I was listening to some sort of speakers here, and I'm also following the news, and there are more and more talks about regulating our lives, regulating media, because disinformation targets women, targets the thing is that we should be protecting our liberties. We shouldn't be giving up our liberties. And rather than being on defensive and like giving up little bits and pieces of our liberty, we should go offensive and expose them, ridicule them. But the thing is that like these kinds of things like disinformation, like fake news and everything, only works if it's the part of a coherent strategy. And in Putin's case, disinformation, fake news, like targeting women, like targeting, I don't know, like minorities, it only works because it's the part of a coherent strategy. And we need that kind of strategy in Western capitals. We need it, and like I hope that at one point we'll have right people and right policies in the Western capitals.
Amen. Carrie.
I'd like to briefly make 3 points. One is I'd like to come back on the shopping for higher education in the West point. If China thought that was in any way a political risk to send its young people to the US or Europe to buy a higher education, it wouldn't be doing it. It thinks it's not a political risk. And the reason for that is it thinks it's worth buying, but those kids are not currently a risk when they go home to China. And that is because there is an authoritarian regime in China currently which believes it is on the rise, and which has persuaded a lot of its people that it is on the rise, and which also believes that the other system is in decline and is not appropriate to China. So that I just want to put that on the record. I personally think that's a great shame. I just also want to put that on the record in case anyone thinks I'm defending the one-party state. I'm not. I'm just saying, show not tell. Make the system that we think is great. Make it great. Keep making it great.
Make it stronger. Make it stronger, because people tend to
I'm
side
not finished tomorrow.
Yeah.
2 more points. 2 more points. Chinese women are incredible. Just incredible. You know, if we had all day, all night, I would tell you so many stories of amazing women in China who do incredible things against almost insuperable odds. And, you know, shout out to all the great feminists in China, because they are having a really rough time right now. But they're not backing down. They have to be careful, but they're not going away, and they are coming back. And, you know, there are various forms of feminism in China, not always in the ways that we would recognize, and that's because they have to kind of camouflage themselves in the current climate. So that is just, they're there. Don't be afraid that there are no great women actually working like everybody in this auditorium for a better future for women. They are there. And the third thing, I'd like to echo what Yevgenia said about not giving in to strong men, because, you know, I've been there. I mean, Madam Secretary said, have we had any of it in our own experience? You know, I've made several pieces about Xi Jinping, or which touched on Xi Jinping. I made a panorama investigative documentary. I wrote a long series of podcasts they didn't like anyway. Over and over again, I've had them threaten me. And I've just said, you know, I'm the BBC's China editor. I'll decide what I do. Your job is your job. My job is my job. And they go, threat, threat, threat. And I go, do your worst. You would be stupid if you did that. I'm not going to go into the details because the BBC is still operating there. But I just said, you know, bring it on if you really want to do that. But you will suffer. And you have to stand up to these people. But you have to do it in a coherent, strategic way, open-eyed, and a way which understands what you're up against.
Yay.
You have to understand it.
Yes. Well, let me thank our 4 panelists for a really lively, invigorating discussion. And let me say, I think there are lessons we can all take away from their experiences and their observations. And one of them is, when you are confronting the potential loss of the values you care about, your freedom, your equality, where you know that it's going to be challenging perhaps, do not be quiet, do not stop talking, do not stop voting, do not give in to those whose views are opposite of what you believe, a democracy like ours or any other should represent. And I hope this conversation we started today will continue. And I look forward to talking again with these 4 women and others about what we're going to do to make sure the strong men don't send us back. We're not going. And I think we want to thank Tina. Where's Tina? Can we thank Tina? There she is. Yay!
Thank you so much. That is just amazing. Thank you, ladies. Thank you. I was just sitting there thinking, this is Women in the World's version of The View, okay? Okay, and I also was thinking how rare it is to actually allow brilliant women, brilliant, well-informed women led by an exceptionally brilliant and well-informed woman, to actually have a conversation, develop ideas, in fact, to even finish a sentence. It is so rare to hear this. In fact, I was sitting there thinking, this is bliss, this is brain sex. Okay? Total brain sex. Actually, I think this should be this is your new life, Hillary. This is your a new TV show, Brain Sex with Hillary Clinton.
I can't wait for the internet to hear that.
Yeah, sorry about that. Just convene all the smart, brilliant women you talk to all the time and just put them out there all the time. Let's just hear from them finally, okay?
Great idea.
So, thank you. Unbelievable women. Carrie Gracie, Tamara, Evgenia. Oh, I love you, Eche.
Me too, Tina.
Thank you for those wonderful words. Palace of Communication, new hashtag, right? Palace of Communication. Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much, Hillary, for this brilliant moderation of this amazing topic. And I want to thank everybody who has been on our stage today. They've been remarkable. They've been on fire. Everyone brought their A game, right? Everybody. It was incredible. Everybody here flew miles and hours, and it really was absolutely worth it. It's a whole course we listened to today. It was really amazing. Tomorrow we're going to start bright and early with the amazing Misty Copeland, first thing at 9. It's another incredible half day tomorrow, different but extraordinary. We have the sea captain, the Australian sea captain who rescues refugees from the Mediterranean. We have Juliana Margulies. We have Sophie Trudeau. It's going to be an amazing day today as well. Thank you so much to everybody for coming.
Great.
See you tomorrow, and thank you, everyone.
It was an honor. Oh, I